Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if All Might becomes Noumu because of All for One, part 1. So before we start, go check out the author of this fanfic, Swiftwidget, link is in the description, also subscribe to our channel, and like this video. So let's begin the video. Speak of the devil, rain slapped against the kitchen window, as outside it fell in sheets. The white noise of rain mixed with the low drone of the television on the counter. Toshinori stared down at his tea, steaming and untouched, hands folded together under his chin. His brows furrowed and lips pressed in a grim line. When? He asked. Last night, Detective Namasa Tsukauchi said flatly. He took a slow sip of his coffee, then roughly pinched the bridge of his nose. Dark bags under his eyes and day-old wrinkles in his shirt spoke to his exhaustion as much as his frustrated sigh, sometime between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. All surveillance cuts out at 3:02 a.m. It's a real security failure. I'm certain quite a few heads will roll once this gets out. If they don't resign first, he tacked on with a grunt. Toshinori hummed darkly. How was it not discovered earlier? Namasa shrugged helplessly, throwing up his hands in exasperation. It's the highest security ward in the country. The only option is having someone working on the inside. Internal Affairs is looking into it now, though I imagine they'll be trumped by national security agents. They'll likely want to make a show of force to ease the public mindset. Namasa set his coffee mug on the counter with a soft clack and walked to the couch. With a groan he sat beside Toshinori. I'm sorry. Toshinori nodded. The knot in the scarred remains of his gut tightened and his right arm ached, the injuries All for One had inflicted on him in his last battle still fresh. His grip on his fingers tightened. What do you think he will do? The detective asked. Toshinori forced himself to relax and sit back against the couch. His breath leaves him in a quiet rush. I don't know, he admitted. Somehow I doubt he will return to the open just yet. Both of us were crippled in the Camino ward. Toshinori flexed his right hand, broken and scarred. It twitched in response, but did little else. He let it drop into his lap. He will want to return to his haunts in the shadows, to his student. Perhaps allow for the public unease to grow once news of his escape is released. Beyond that, I'm as blind as you. Namasa clapped a hand on Toshinori's good shoulder and squeezed. Toshinori nodded and sighed. His wounded pride raging in his chest. This was a complete loss. What now? Toshinori asked the quiet of the house. We notified the school. Prepare for the shitstorm, Namasa replied. Then we tried again. Toshinori curled his good hand into a fist. He had already given his all at the Camino ward, he couldn't even buff up to his hero form anymore. There was not another fight left in him. Yeah, Toshinori sighed. He reached out and took his cup of tea in hand. It had gone cold. Let me give you a ride back to the UA, Namasa offered, leaning against a hallway wall. Toshinori waved off the offer casually. You need sleep. You look like death, he remarked. Said pot to kettle, Namasa quipped, crossing his arms stubbornly, the effect ruined by his gaping yawn. Toshinori scoffed and smiled lightly as he shrugged on his long coat. It's alright, he said, I can manage. I've called for a car. Namasa nodded and shoved his hands in his pockets. Say hi to your students for me, Namasa grinned cheekily, that book I gave you any help? Shut it, Toshinori grumbled, shaking his umbrella loose. You've read it, then? Namasa's tired grin widened. Toshinori sent him an ineffective scowl while his old friend laughed. Good night, Namasa, he huffed, pulling the door open. Night, Namasa called, as Toshinori closed the door behind him. Toshinori huddled under his wide umbrella as he shuffled to the curb, regretting his choice of shoes as he stepped into a puddle, the water sloping up and soaking into his socks. Headlights cut through the rain as the UA. The car pulled up to the curb. Toshinori yanked the back door open, cursing when the wind nearly tugged his umbrella from his hand and the rain soaked his hair and shoulders. He dropped into the backseat, shaking the rain off the umbrella before pulling it in and laying it at his feet. Thanks for picking me up, Hibiki, Toshinori called to his usual driver as he shut the door and slid over. I know it was short notice. No problem at all, Hibiki replied as he pulled away from the curb. Toshinori sighed as he attempted to brush the remaining raindrops from his coat. Something is bothering you tonight? Hibiki asked. Toshinori moved to fluffing his soaking wet hair, only glancing up briefly. In the dark of the cab, he couldn't see his driver very well. It was raining. Makes my joints ache. Just getting old. You aren't that old, Hibiki said, a grin in his voice. Toshinori chuckled warmly, my students say the same. They're good kids. They turned out of the residential neighborhood and onto busier streets. The night seemed quiet. A troubled frown tugged at the corners of Toshinori's mouth. All for One was out there, threatening the peace he could no longer protect. A pathetic thought rose from the back of his mind. He ran a hand down his face, suddenly feeling weary to his bones. He watched as they passed the first streetlight, the falling rain lit up around it like ropes of silver. Still working on those impressions of yours, Hibiki? Toshinori asked absently, settling back in his seat. The driver hummed, as if in thought, you could say that. There was an odd lilt in his voice. Toshinori looked up curiously. They passed under another streetlight. Toshinori's blood ran cold. Ah, the driver smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He had no eyes. Only scar tissue. I found out. I suppose impersonations can't fool the former symbol of peace. Shit. Toshinori reached instinctively for One for All. The world went dark and silent. It wasn't the cold or the bright light bleeding through his eyelids that finally woke Toshinori. It was the smell. Sickly and sterile and metallic with an undercurrent of latex. He could never forget the smell of a hospital. Toshinori was on his knees, hunched forward and held up by the tension in his arms. He hissed as he pulled himself up. Sharp pain shot through his shoulders and down his spine, his back and shoulder muscles spasming as they settled back into place. Something rattled and dragged loud and low. Toshinori looked to his right. Chains. He was shackled and chained to the wall. Shit, Toshinori ground out, giving the heavy chain an experimental tug. His range of movement stopped just in front of his chest. The shackle dug into his wrist, the skin underneath was already red and itching. He was surprised it hadn't been rubbed raw yet. He let his hand fall and shivered. His coat and shoes were gone, along with their familiar warmth, and his hair still slightly damp and chilled at the roots from the rain. He couldn't have been here long. The pinch take pulled his attention left. His left arm was held out, shackled to a much shorter chain that hung from the wall. By his left hand, almost close enough to touch, a stationary IV pole stood. Toshinori's gaze followed the clear tube from the hanging bag down until he twisted his left hand. The IV tube ended at the back of his hand. That explained the ache. His heart hammered a little harder against his ribsage, pumping the clear cool intravenous drip through his veins. Toshinori looked away and leaned back, his head gently bumping against the cold wall behind him. He took a steadying breath. Okay. This is happening. I can handle this. He jumped in surprise when the door opposite him opened. Toshinori didn't know what he might have suspected, but a nurse in full scrubs and a clipboard was knotted. He watched her as she scanned the clipboard, eyes half-lidded in boredom. Ma'am? He blurted, blinking in confusion, and his voice cracking incredulously. The nurse glanced up at him, then back to her clipboard, as if nothing was amiss. She laid the clipboard on the small counter by the door and approached him. She waved her hand and made a fist. Toshinori grunted as the slack in the chains leapt up and coiled around his right arm, pulling it back and taut against the wall. I see, Toshinori thought grimly, watching the nurse from behind his bangs as his back was forced flat against the wall. He tensed when he spotted the scalpel. Hey. The nurse nicked the inside of his forearm and pressed the sides of the cut, blood beading along the short line. She watched it carefully, for what Toshinori didn't. His focus on the cut intensified. It didn't. The sting had already faded. He watched with mild horror as the blood receded back into his skin. The skin around the cut itched and slowly knit itself back together, leaving only a faint white line. Accelerated healing quirk has assimilated smoothly, the nurse stated as she straightened and examined the IV bag, the bored look on her face never changing. Your bedside manner could use some work, ma'am, Toshinori said with a challenging grin. His voice lowered and boisterous, albeit raspy like his hero persona. Old habits die hard. The nurse glanced at him briefly but said nothing. She returned to the counter by the door, jotting something down on her clipboard before retrieving something from a small basket. Toshinori grimaced as his abdomen clenched. He didn't have to see what she was doing. He recognized the sounds of the syringe being freed from its packaging, the pop of a vial being opened, the click of the needle cap being pulled away. The nurse finally turned enough for him to see her tapping the syringe, the needle still inside the vial filled with something dark and red. I'm up to date on all my vaccinations, Toshinori said with a strained smile, his mouth practically running itself. His smile twitched as she approached, and I've already made an appointment to get a flu shot, so that really isn't necessary. The nurse paused, IV bag in one hand and syringe in the other. She gave him a thoughtful look. Do you ever shut up? She asked flatly. Toshinori blinked and tried not to look like he had been slapped. The nurse pressed the needle through the IV bag port, dark red rushing in and tainting the clear solution as she pressed the plunger with practiced efficiency. She pulled out the needle, twisting the IV bag to watch the red tint the solution evenly before sealing the port and returning to the counter. I'd hate to be one of your usual patients, Toshinori said lamely, but his focus was drawn to the bag. The red solution blood, Toshinori thought with a detached certainty, it's his blood. Dripped slowly from the bag to the tube, gravity, and his own heart pulling the taint closer to his hand. He fought the urge to reach for One for All, to touch the void that once held that flame. He fought the urge to struggle, to yank at the chains he knew he could not break, to flail, and fight, and lose in front of the callous woman observing him. Instead, he waited and watched as the tainted blood of All For One slunk into his veins with an anticlimactic finality. He hadn't even noticed the nurse leaving or the chains going slack. For a while, nothing happened. Toshinori wasn't sure how much time passed. There were no windows and no clock, only the steady drip of the IV. It started out as an itch. Toshinori rubbed his back against the wall, frowning when the prickling itch only spread down his spine and up his neck. He let out a frustrated sigh and reached his hand back, scratching between his shoulders. His hand froze, fingertips brushing against what felt like stubble. Toshinori bent forward and grit his teeth, forcing himself to lay his hand flat against his spine. The itch shifted to pins and needles tugging at the middle of his back. Thick, bristly hair pushed from his skin, brushing against his scarred palm and fingers. With a quick tug he yanked one from between his shoulder blades and held it in front of his face. It was blonde. Shit. Toshinori spat, gripping the pale strand in his fist as he bowed forward, eyes squeezed tightly closed. Shit. Goddamn it. Fuck. He curled in on himself, taking slow shaking breaths as the pins and needles sensation faded. The ridge of blonde hair rubbed uncomfortably against the inside of his shirt, demanding to be felt, impossible to ignore. Sweat coated his brow. He pressed the heel of his hand between his eyes, then abruptly scrubbed his hand down his face. Toshinori let out a broken bark of laughter and nodded. Okay, he said to the empty room, okay. He raised his hand again, placing it on the back of his head and carting his fingers through his hair. Then hesitantly, he let his hand slide down to his neck. The new hair, the wrong hair, felt the same as his own in length and texture. He grimaced as he traced his fingers around the base of his skull. Where had his hairline ended before? His hand slid farther down, chain clicking and following over his shoulder and under his shirt. His hand stopped between his shoulder blades and he pressed his palm flat. The stripe of hair was only just as wide as his hand, the skin on either side unchanged. The skin under his palm twitched in irritation at the pressure, while the hair bristled at the touch. Toshinori pulled his hand from his shirt and let it fall to his lap. Alright, he said, arching his back and rolling his shoulders in an attempt to get the hair to lie flat under his shirt and failing, it's just hair. What's a little hair? He leaned against the wall and immediately pulled away with an irritated grunt. Impatiently, he reached back and brushed down at his shirt before giving up being comfortable with a sigh. Feels like I've got a wool scarf stuffed down my shirt, he groused. The deadbolt abruptly unlocked with a loud click. And the door swung open. The nurse stepped inside, still turned toward the hall. Assimilating well. He is stable and talkative, she stated in that same bored tone, backing away from the open door. Nurse Toshinori greeted me with a cheeky smile, done terrorizing your other patients. The nurse glanced into the hall, I see why you dislike him. Not dislike, said the voice in the hall. Toshinori tensed, his hackles bristling under his shirt and eyes burning with fury. All For One stepped in from the hall, face covered in a new black mask. I despised him. Slowly, Toshinori pulled himself up, standing as best he could with the shackles digging down into his wrists. The pinch in his left hand worsened as he cut off circulation to the IV drip. Look at you, symbol of peace, All For One said, face tilting as he held out his hands. You obliterated so many of my comrades with that body, and now mere chains can hold you down. Are you really so weak? You are an echo of your former self. Toshinori glared up at his mortal enemy, straining at the shackles to stand at his full height. Gran Torino's warning from the Camino ward repeating in his mind unbidden. Don't let him provoke you. Don't trade words with him anymore. Toshinori remained silent. Itsumi, All For One turned to the nurse and in a mocking tone said, I thought you said he was talkative. The nurse shrugged impartially, retrieving a thick metal band from the cabinet and turning it over in her hands. Toshinori's focus remained on All For One, his glare unwavering. All For One regarded him for a moment, bending slightly to Toshinori's level. Itsumi, if you would, he said, straightening. The nurse looked up from the metal band and nodded. She released the band, but it did not fall. It remained floating mid-air metal manipulation quirk, Toshinori thought, then it shot across the room and clamped around his thin neck. With a quick downward gesture, the nurse yanked Toshinori's head forward by his neck. Toshinori grit his teeth and fought, thin back and leg muscles straining to keep him upright. The pressure around his neck tightened and forced him lower. Shame flared in his gut as Toshinori panted and his gaze landed on his legs. They were shaking with the effort to simply stay standing. Then something hitched sharply in his chest and he coughed. His knees buckled and he fell, roughly jarring his knees on the tiled floor. Blood sprayed between his teeth as he tried to stifle the hacking coughing fit that had done him in. It dripped down his chin and onto the floor as his breath rattled wetly in his chest. His arm twitched, instinctively moving to wipe the blood away, but it had been pinned behind him by the manipulated chain. A hand brushed the back of his bowed head and slunk to the base of his neck. There was a tug at his shirt collar and a loud tearing. The material of his shirt fell to his sides as his back was exposed to the cold hospital air. The hand returned, brushing down against the bristling blonde hackles on Toshinori's back. Too late did he recognize the polished black shoes in front of him. Toshinori involuntarily bucked against the unmoving metal hold at his neck and wrists, mentally willing All For One to burst into flames or drop dead on the spot. Anything to get the villain's clammy hand off him. Ridged mane, All For One said, grabbing a fistful of the hair at the base of Toshinori's neck, a virtually useless mutant form quirk. It had potential to be of use and powerful given time and the right quirk mixing. But it was hampered by poor breeding and the introduction of the quirkless gene. It suits you. Toshinori furrowed his brow, searching for even the most minute member of One For All. Just a split second to transform and break free from the chains that bound him. You're just as useless now. So much for the great All Might. All For One continued, who would have suspected the world's false hero was born quirkless? Toshinori froze. How? Even your predecessor had her own quirk before receiving One For All. All For One rambled thoughtfully, dragging his fingers through the blonde hackles again, scraping his fingernails against Toshinori's spine before pulling his hand away. Imagine my surprise when I tried to take yours and found nothing left in you. What could your master have been thinking when she passed on the quirk I fathered to a subhuman child? Don't you dare speak of her. Toshinori wanted to roar, to pull back his fist and strike All For One down again for mentioning his predecessor. Instead, he looked up and glared at the villain, eyes burning and heart beating slow and strong and proud. How could something so obsolete become such a thorn in my side? All For One asked, leaning down closer to Toshinori's eye level. Ah, but this presents a unique opportunity. Your breed is so rare. I have never had the chance to work with a perfect blank canvas. No inborn quirks to complicate my work. Toshinori held the man's non-existent stare. He had already known All For One never planned to kill him. If he had, he would have already done it. And he had already suspected. Additionally, many of my previous creations were captured and are beyond my reach. I will have to make more. All For One straightened and gestured to the whole of Toshinori. How fortunate I can kill two birds with one stone. The metal against Toshinori's neck and wrist slackened marginally. It was only a little, but perhaps I will remake you. I will rename you. All For One's voice quieted, Noumu. Toshinori grit his teeth and pushed himself up until his back was straight and proud, not missing the way the nurse's hand shook with effort at her limit. You can try. The rain poured through the night and into the morning. The sky was dark, still overcast with a blanket of gray clouds. Naomasa Tsukauchi stirred his coffee absently, watching droplets race down the kitchen window. Toshinori was right. Naomasa had needed a good night's sleep after the day before and in preparation of the eventual shitshow to come. He sighed and took a long sip from his mug. At least the coffee was decent. His cell phone rang, the simple ringtone for work calls, and he pulled it from his pocket. This is Detective Tsukauchi. Ah, good morning. This is Officer Hamada with homicide, said the man on the other line. There's been an incident with signs pointing toward a violent crime committed with a quirk. Since this is part of your department's jurisdiction, I was told to call you in. Naomasa nodded and set his mug down in the sink, grabbing a pen and paper from the counter. Where? Detective Tsukauchi, a middle-aged police officer, greeted Naomasa as he ducked under the crime scene tape. I'm Officer Hamada. We spoke over the phone. Thank you for coming. This way. What happened? Naomasa asked, glancing around the car park. Uniform black cars lined the lot, each shined like new, as was to be expected of the high-end hero driving service. A few he passed had the UA insignia etched into plaques on the hoods. That's right, Naomasa thought. This company partners with the UA. One of the drivers came in this morning and found the body of a coworker. Officer Hamada gestured to a young woman wrapped in a blanket and sitting at the back of a nearby ambulance. She discovered it in the locker room. She's really shaken up. Naomasa nodded, and it's believed the homicide was committed with a quirk. I think it's pretty clear that's the case, Officer Hamada grimaced as he led Naomasa into the adjacent office building. Just down here. At the end of the hall, a small group of officers speaking with a forensic scientist stood by an open door. Camera flashes lit up the hall from within the room. The forensic scientist paused when she spotted their approach. You're with the Quirk Crimes Division? She asked as Naomasa stopped in front of her. I am. Detective Naomasa Tsukauchi, he said, holding out his hand. She shook it with a nod. The hero Sato, she replied, tapping the ID card clipped to her shirt. She turned away briefly, stooping to pick up a small box from the floor. She pulled out 2 shoe covers and handed them to Naomasa. Put these on. I can't have you tracking anything from outside. Naomasa slipped the covers on and followed her into the locker room. Officer Hamada followed soon after donning his own covers. Have you ever worked with a homicide, detective? Sato asked as she rounded a wall of lockers. I have, Naomasa replied. Good. I'd rather you didn't hurl at my crime scene. Sato said curtly. When he saw the body, Naomasa understood her concern. Two spiraled bone spears pierced through the man's shoulder and chest, pinning him to the back wall. "Watch your step," Sato said, walking around labeled blood splatter. Naomasa nodded grimly, then jumped slightly when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He quickly pulled it out, glancing at the unfamiliar number before tucking it back in his pants pocket. "We think he was on his way out," Sato said, gesturing to the man's driver uniform. "Driver's license identifies him as Hibiki Genji." "Hibiki?" Naomasa sighed. "Oh no. Do you know him?" Officer Hamada asked. "Not personally. My friend teaches at UA, and Hibiki is his usual driver." Naomasa shook his head. "He was a good man." "I'm sorry to hear that," Sato said solemnly. "Sato, the camera is set up and ready to record," said a younger forensic field tech. Beside him was a video camera on a tripod. "Thanks, Akio." Sato moved to stand beside the body. Officer Hamada leaned toward Naomasa. "Sato is the homicide division's best forensic scientist. On top of that, her afterimage quirk is invaluable." "Afterimage?" Naomasa asked. "Watch," Officer Hamada nodded to Sato. "Make a note that I am placing my bare hand on the deceased's right shoulder," Sato said. She then did so and took a long deep breath. When she opened her eyes, they looked clouded. In the center of the room, a ghostly image of Hibiki Genji appeared. The image was talking on the phone, though no sound came from him. He laughed and pocketed the phone before moving to a nearby locker. He appeared to open it and pulled a set of keys from inside. Then Hibiki jumped, startled. He looked over his shoulder, brow furrowing in confusion. He called out, growing more cautious and uncertain as seconds passed. Hibiki's eyes went wide. He flew back and slammed into the wall where his physical body remained and clutched his shoulder, ghostly hand gripping at the bone spear. His face twisted in pain, silently shouting until a hand-shaped impression pressed against his face. Hibiki's eyes went wide, panic flaring and tears spilling from them. He shook his head and cringed. The impression of the hand disappeared and Hibiki slumped slightly, breathing hard. Then he glared, his eyes following some unseen person as they moved to leave the locker room. He spoke and spat on the ground, a pain-defiant grin splitting his face. His body jolted and his expression fell. His ghostly hand moved to loosely grip the bone spear in his chest. The light left his eyes and his head fell. The afterimage finally overlapped the physical body and faded away. Sato removed her hand from the deceased and cleaned it with a cloth given to her by another field tech. "That all that?" she asked. The man gave her a thumbs up before taking down the video camera and tripod. "Also, Yuta, see if you can get any fingerprints from his face. We could get lucky." She turned to Naomasa. "Your thoughts?" "You were right to call." Naomasa gestured to the bone spears. "You may get DNA from those assuming they were generated by the attacker's body. Unfortunately, I can't say this kind of quirk is familiar. Whoever did this may not have a record, but I'll gladly work with you to put this killer behind bars." "Sure thing," Sato said with a curt nod. "Same to you. You have work still to do." "I'll get out of your way for now," Naomasa said, thanking Sato and her fellow forensic technicians before following Officer Hamada from the crime scene. As he was walking from the building, his phone buzzed. Naomasa paused, pulling the phone from his pocket. A voicemail notification popped up. It was from an unfamiliar number. He selected it and raised his phone to his ear. "Hi, this is Izuku Midoriya. I'm a All Might student. We've met a few times. He gave me your number as an emergency contact, not that this is an emergency. It's just, All Might didn't show up for our morning training, which isn't like him. He mentioned he was going to see you last night. Did he stay over maybe? Or tell you where he was going? Usually he gets a ride back." Naomasa almost dropped his phone when a truly dreadful thought clicked into place. Tashinori got a ride. Naomasa practically flew back into the building and down the hall. He came to a stop at the locker room door, breathless and startling the younger officers present. "Sato!" Naomasa shouted before reining in his voice. He had to be overthinking things. Hoped beyond hope he was overthinking things. "Detective?" Sato appeared from behind the lockers. "Did you think of something?" "The time of death," Naomasa said, his voice still too loud. "Do you know his time of death?" Sato gave him a curious look. "Based on the deceased's rigor mortis, we estimated the time of death was around 7 p.m. last night." Bread dropped like a stone in Naomasa's gut. Tashinori had called for a ride back to the UA. Hibiki was his driver. Tashinori would never call anyone else. There had been headlights outside the window and the slam of a car door. It was already 9 p.m. when he'd left. Naomasa raised his phone and dialed Tashinori. He paced a ways down the hall, running a hand through his hair as the phone continued to ring. "Pick up Tashinori," he muttered through his teeth. "This is Tashinori Yagi." "Tashinori, I can't answer the phone. Please leave a message." "Damn." Naomasa almost threw the phone against the wall as nausea flared against the dread. After a slow breath, he said, "Toshinori, I need you to call me back as soon as you get this. It's important." He slammed the end call button and shoved his phone back into his pocket. Sato came up from behind him, raking him with an intelligent, curious gaze. "Are you onto something?" she asked. Namasa covered his mouth and furrowed his brow. "I sincerely hope not." If the smell hadn't given it away that he was imprisoned in a hospital, the food did. Prepackaged sandwiches, jello, and broth, a mix of items that were either for patients or their visitors. Food he had sworn he would never eat again after his many surgeries and stays at other hospitals. So much for that. He tore the plastic wrap off a turkey and cheese sandwich with his teeth and bit into it. Could use mayo, he thought dully. He huffed. "Could I get some condiments next time?" He called toward the closed door. Not that he expected anyone to answer, or hear him for that matter. From what he saw of the dark hallway outside the door, he suspected he was in a basement level. Likely some closed-down, ancient wing that was never updated to accommodate the vast variety of people's quirks. Fortunately for Toshinori, that narrowed down his list of possible locations greatly. He grinned in thought, munching on the dry sandwich. There were 7 hospitals he knew of that did not fully update, were old enough to make updating more trouble than just adding on, and large enough to afford having abandoned the old wings in favor of the new wings. 2 of those hospitals were close enough to drive to by car from Detective Tsukauchi in less time than it took for the rain in Toshinori's hair to dry. That was assuming All for One did not use his transmission quirk, which was unlikely since he could not send himself through transmission as well. He frowned as he crumpled up the sandwich wrapper with his one free hand and tossed it to the wasta bin across the room. The ball of plastic bounced off the rim and away from the bin. "Shit," Toshinori grumbled, hackles rising at his irritation. He narrowed his eyes at the offending ball of plastic just out of reach and nowhere near the waste bin. "That's going to bug me." He absently rolled his shoulders in an attempt to get the hair along his spine to lie flat, not that it ever laid flat, he had quickly figured out. It was as unruly as the wild mane of hair on his head. Toshinori leaned back against the wall, his bare back twitching at the cold surface briefly, and he pulled up a knee to rest his elbow against. 2 possible hospitals, he mused. Either Rishi General Hospital or Jeddah Central. As for escape routes, something buzzed on the counter by the door. Once, twice, up to 8 times before it stopped. Moments later there was a short buzz, and it silenced. Toshinori furrowed his brow. That buzzing had been on and off since they brought him his first meal in what he assumed was morning. Part of him wondered if the quiet male nurse had left his cell phone on the counter. When he stood to see the counter earlier in the day, he was annoyed to find a tissue box was in front of the buzzing phone. Maybe they're trying a new torture method. Toshinori thought with a huff. At least it broke the boredom and silence. Footsteps clacked outside the door. Toshinori tensed and rose to his feet. The nurses all wore soft-bottom shoes and walked almost silently. The only person who wore hard-heeled dress shoes was. The door opened, slow and deliberate. "Don't stand on my account," All for One said, smug, as Toshinori strained against the short chains. His head canted slightly. "You're quiet. Have you taken a vow of silence?" A small, forced smile pulled at the end of Toshinori's mouth. He wouldn't give the villain the satisfaction. Then the phone buzzed again. All for One turned and reached to the counter. "What is this?" he asked, an odd lilt in his voice. "Ah, you have a call." All for One plucked a red phone from the counter. Toshinori froze, eyes going wide. It was his. It was his own damn phone. All for One turned the screen toward Toshinori and hummed. "Tell me, who is calling?" Toshinori's heart raced in his chest and his forced smile fell. "Izuku." The boy's photo, the one from the first day of training, lit up the screen. "Ah, so it is your student. Your successor." All for One tapped the screen. "All Might." Izuku's voice rang hollow through the room. Toshinori's shoulders shook under the strain he put on the chains. "All Might, are you there?" There was an uncertain tremor in Izuku's voice. Toshinori's resolve shattered. "Midoriya, my boy." Toshinori blurted. The phone crumpled in All for One's fist. "You broke your silence." All for One stated, letting the crumpled pieces of the phone fall to the tiled floor. "Have I found the weakness in your pride? That boy, Izuku Midoriya. Don't you say his name." Toshinori roared and hacked, blood dripping from his chin. His eyes burned with a fury. All for One strode toward Toshinori and chuckled darkly. "I wonder how that pride of yours would fare with his blood on your hands." Noumu. The edge of All for One's shape blurred and Toshinori braced. He couldn't move impossibly fast anymore, but his eyes still did. All for One flew forward, his clammy hand clapping over Toshinori's mouth. Toshinori's knees buckled as his shoulders slammed into the wall. His skull rattled and he grit his teeth. Something warm seeped through them. He recognized the metallic taste. The guttural shout raged against the hand pressed to his mouth, his shackles biting into his skin as he struggled. "The All Might. Damn you." But his arms shook with weakness. He roared and dug in deep, using every ounce of strength. Something snapped in his inner elbow, and pain flared through his arm. Then All For One backed away, pulling a white handkerchief from his suit pocket and wiping his palm. The cloth came away stained red. Toshinori spat at his feet, breathing raggedly. His arm hung limp at his side, already itching and twitching as the accelerating healing began its work. He spat again for good measure and glared up at All For One. The villain tucked the handkerchief back in his breast pocket. "Nothing left to say?" he asked. Toshinori's gaze burned blue and strong. He wiped the blood from his lips the moment his arm was whole again. "I wonder how long that stamina will last," All For One pondered, voice flat and distant. Toshinori had determinedly returned to his plans of escape. How much weight could the chains carry before the screws in the wall gave way? How long were the screws? What material lay behind the tiled wall? He had tugged on the chain again, experimentally putting his body weight under it. It didn't budge. Toshinori huffed and swallowed roughly. Sweat coated his brow. His insides burned. The female nurse, Tatsumi, returned soon after, followed by the young male nurse. Nurse Tatsumi brought more chains. Without a word, she pinned his arms to his sides while adding the chains to the wall and his shackles, extending his range of movement. When she released him, he rubbed the bases of his wrists. "Don't tear out your IV. You'll need it," she said, sounding bored as ever. She pointed to a low wall near the corner of the room. "There's the toilet." Isamu, the young male nurse, flinched at the sound of his name. "Clean this up." The female nurse gestured to the blood splatter on the floor. "Yes, ma'am," Isamu's voice was subdued. He pulled cleaning supplies from the cupboard below the counter and began to scrub at the bloodstains. He shot nervous glances at Toshinori before his gaze returned to the floor. "I'd hate to have her as a boss," Toshinori quipped suddenly. Grinning conspiratorially at the young nurse when he looked at him, his eyes round in shock. "If you want a break from that, we could trade places," Toshinori continued, holding up his shackled wrist. His arm shook slightly and he let it fall to his abdomen. The twisting, burning sensation was getting worse. "Ignore him," Nurse Tatsumi ordered as she replaced the near-empty IV bag. "He likes to talk." Isamu looked between the female nurse and Toshinori, a conflicted look on his face. "You know that's All Might, right?" he asked quietly. The nurse twisted around, her face pinched in anger. Toshinori tried not to grunt in pain when the shackles tightened around his wrists, his bones groaning under the pressure. "That's A," the woman stated, her voice low. Then she let out a breath and her bored expression returned. "Just do your job." Isamu bowed his head, thoroughly cowed. "Yes, ma'am." Something buzzed at the nurse's side. She glanced at the pager. "I'm needed in pediatrics." "Finish up here," Nurse Tatsumi ordered before walking briskly from the room. "That woman really should not work with kids," Toshinori choked out, grimacing against the growing nausea in his gut. Now that the witch was gone, his facade crumbled. He let his head fall back against the tiled wall, savoring the cold pressed to his overheated back and shivering. "Here," Isamu's voice shook and he backed away quickly when Toshinori opened his eyes again. He'd brought the Wastabin closer. He'd even thrown the sandwich wrapper away. "If you need to vomit but can't get to the toilet," the young nurse explained, not meeting Toshinori's gaze. Toshinori chuckled, hissing when pain shot through his chest. "You're a good kid," he said, smiling when the young man shot him a distraught look. Isamu shook his head and stood, nervously running his fingers over the small spikes on the back of his neck. "I'm really not," the young man almost whispered. He quickly put away the cleaning supplies and strode to the door. "I'm sorry that you got mixed up with this," Toshinori called softly from his spot. Isamu paused in the doorway and almost looked back. "Me too," his bent posture said. Then he left, locking the door behind him. Toshinori shook, his eyes closed tight against the light and the nausea and pain twisting his insides. He wheezed against his fist. The air rattled in his throat and he coughed. Dots of red coated his shaking fingers. He was on his side, facing the wall and pressing his feverish throbbing forehead against the cool tiles. He couldn't remember when he had laid down. His gut clenched with nausea and he forced his torso up, retching into the Wastabin. Nothing but bile came up. Exhausted and trembling weakly, he pushed the bin away and collapsed back onto the floor, relishing the cold of the tile. The pressure in his skull increased, as though it was in a vice. Something cracked at the back of his jawbone and he saw white. When Toshinori woke again, the burning pain in his insides had reduced to what felt like bad heartburn. He groaned and rubbed his sore jaw. "So that's what taking one of my punches feels like," he thought darkly. Toshinori rolled onto his back, cringing at the sensation of his soaked ridge hair sticking to his skin. He slowly pulled himself up with the help of the chains and leaned against the wall. His throat ached. He swallowed roughly and coughed. It was like someone had scrubbed his vocal cords with sandpaper. The chill ran over his bare skin. Toshinori looked down. His shirt was in tatters, holes eaten away by what looked like chemical burns. It smelt of bile and blood. "Raise your arms, Noumu." Toshinori tensed and turned, his still feverish throbbing head delaying his response time. Nurse Tatsumi stood in front of him, a bored look on her face and scissors in hand. Nurse Isamu was near the door, gaze lowered. He carried the warped remains of the waste bin, holes melted through the plastic. Noumu, the nurse snapped her fingers, earning herself a glare from Toshinori. Raise your arms. I'm not a Toshinori growled. At least, he had tried. The noise that left him did not sound human. Nurse Tatsumi's eyes widened. And she smiled. Say that again. Toshinori's hackles rose all down his spine as he froze. He swallowed. His throat was still terribly sore. Maybe he hadn't. Toshinori's gaze slid over to meet the young man. Isamu's face paled and he shrunk toward the door, his trembling hand covering his mouth. The fear in the young man's eyes was like a blow to the chest, knocking the wind from him. Toshinori didn't realize he had raised his hand to reach for him until it fell into his lap. Sensei said you had taken a vow of silence, the nurse said smugly. I suppose this new quirk will help. Her mocking grin widened. Where did that fire in your eyes go? Toshinori was silent. Suddenly, the shackles yanked his arms up and to the side. Hey. Toshinori shouted, the word coming out mangled as a rasping, gurgling snarl. It caught painfully in his throat and he coughed. Isamu, Nurse Tatsumi turned to the nurse cowering by the door, come here and help me. I can't hold him, and cut the shirt away. Isamu stared at the middle-aged nurse in horror, but one glare from her and he shuffled over. The female nurse shoved the scissors into his hands and pushed him forward. The young man shook but did not get closer. He can't move, Isamu. Stop being ridiculous, Nurse Tatsumi said impatiently. Isamu flinched under the woman's harsh words and knelt. Toshinori watched as the young man took his tattered sleeve in hand and began cutting it away. Isamu's hands shook and he tried to rush. The sharp blades of the scissors cut into Toshinori's skin. Isamu pulled the scissors away and looked physically ill. I'm sorry. He blurted, finally meeting Toshinori's soft blue gaze. Toshinori gave him a small patient smile. Isamu paused, staring in disbelief at the calm, pitying expression. He bit his lip and steeled himself. He resumed cutting away the ruined shirt, mumbling almost inaudibly under his breath. I'm sorry, All Might, he whispered. The left sleeve fell away, exposing Toshinori's twisted scar and skeletal frame. Isamu nearly dropped the scissors. Instead, he covered his mouth and pointedly looked away from the scar. He pulled the shirt away and stood. Without a word, he turned and left. Nurse Tatsumi huffed as she watched the young man leave. Coward, she said. Far braver than you, Toshinori thought as the chains continued to hold his arms in place. The nurse's gaze returned, her eyes raking over Toshinori's exposed torso. Now you are starting to look proper. He only glared. After the witch had left him alone, Toshinori had tried and failed to speak. His words all came out wrong, some sounding distinctly. He tried not to think back to that first fight with the villain alliance. There was only something wrong with his throat, he had reasoned. He would adapt and think a way around it. He had to. At some point, Toshinori must have fallen asleep and laid down. He woke with a start when he heard the lock click again. He sat up, sore and disoriented in the never-changing bright light of the room. No one was there with him. Confused, Toshinori looked around. On the floor, near where his head had been, was a clean folded hospital gown. Oh, Toshinori sighed and let a small smile tug at his thin lips. That young man. He shook his head as he lifted the hospital gown from the floor, grateful for a moment that not everything All For One touched became twisted. Izuku trained every morning at 6 a.m. When All Might moved into the Class 1A dorm, he joined Izuku on the field, a welcome addition to Izuku's mornings. The transition was seamless and natural. It was, as it had been for those 10 months of hell, before All Might passed one for all to him. Before the UA. Before Kamino. When the field was empty that morning, Izuku hadn't thought much of All Might's absence at first. The retired hero was still healing from his fight with All For One and usually appeared on the sidelines of the training field while Izuku was still warming up, a steaming thermos of tea in hand and huddled in his long coat against the morning chill. Some days he contented himself with watching the Izuku train, allowing the boy to think through his own movements. Other days he got up, walked onto the field and gave Izuku small tips and advice lightly disguised with casual jokes. All Might's raspy laugh and praise echoed loudly across the field in those early morning hours. But not today. Izuku gripped his cell phone tight, All Might's voicemail repeating from the speaker. Izuku hung up and bit his lip. An uneasy feeling coiled in his gut and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. All Might always called back on the rare occasions he couldn't answer right away, but it had been hours since Izuku's first call. Where are you? Izuku nervously bounced his leg, glancing outside. The overcast sky was far too dark for midday. The clouds hung ominously low, still heavy with rain. Early fall winds blew through the cracked window and sent a chill into the room. It smelled like rain. Izuku almost launched off his bed when his cell phone rang loudly. "Her phone call is here." All Might's boisterous voice called from the phone speaker. Izuku scrambled to answer, forgetting in his rush to check the ID. Hello?" Izuku answered, patting his chest lightly to calm his pounding heart. "Ah, is this Izuku Midoriya?" "This is Detective Tsukauchi," said the man on the other line. Oh. Gee, good afternoon," Izuku stuttered. "Did you?" "I'm heading to the UA now to speak with Principal Nedzu." Detective Tsukauchi interrupted briskly. Then he paused and took a steadying breath. "It would be best if you were there as well, Midoriya." Izuku's brow furrowed in confusion, but he nodded. "Oh, okay. I'm about 10 minutes away. Principal Nedzu knows I'm coming. I'll meet you in his office." The wind howled on the other end before the line was cut. Izuku let his hand drop into his lap and glanced out the window again. Darker clouds were rolling in and a raindrop tapped against the glass pane. A storm was brewing. Izuku's grip tightened around his phone. Thunder rumbled distantly. "Where are you, All Might?" Izuku sat on the couch in the principal's office and fidgeted nervously. He glanced between Principal Nedzu and Detective Tsukauchi who sat across from them. He jumped slightly when the principal patted his back with a soft paw. The mouse dog bear-like principal held out a small teacup. "Thank you," Izuku said quietly, taking the cup in hand. "Some for you, as well, Detective." "No, thank you," Tsukauchi politely declined the offered cup and folded his hands together. He sighed grimly. "As you both know, All Might defeated All for One at the Camino Ward and we were able to take him into custody." He paused. 2 nights ago, it is believed someone working in the highest security ward cut all surveillance and aided in All for One's escape. His location is unknown." Izuku's teacup fell from his hands. What? A shudder involuntarily ran through him. After everything All Might, Izuku's shoulders shook and he pressed a hand over his mouth. The terror of that day roared back. All for One's raw power and callous treatment of life. All Might bleeding and beaten down, true form revealed to the world and used the very last of One for All to defeat him. Tears welled in Izuku's eyes. "No." Principal Nedzu placed a dropped teacup on the coffee table and lightly patted Izuku's knee. "Thank you for telling us this," Nedzu said, turning back to the detective. "I assume this hasn't been made public yet." "No," Tsukauchi answered, "not yet. I imagine there will be a press conference soon. Those leading the investigation will want to control the flow of information to avoid public speculation and panic as much as possible." Izuku's phone buzzed lightly and he quickly pulled it from his pocket. His shoulders slumped. It was a hero spotting notification for Kamui Woods. Still nothing from All Might. "Something wrong, Midoriya?" Principal Nedzu asked. Detective Tsukauchi spoke up. "That's another reason I came. This morning I was called to the Tantive Company to aid in investigating the death of Hibiki Genji." "That name's familiar," Nedzu nodded. "One of our drivers. He was Toshinori's All Might's driver," Tsukauchi said. He bent forward, brows furrowed and shoulders heavy. "All Might was with me until just after 9 p.m. before he called from a ride back to the UA well after Hibiki's estimated time of death. Neither I nor young Midoriya have been in contact with him since." Principal Nedzu frowned grimly. "I see." Izuku stared down at his fists, trembling in his lap. Horror stirred in his gut, slow and heavy. He felt sick. Izuku felt a hand on his shoulder and he looked up, meeting Detective Tsukauchi's gaze. The detective squeezed Izuku's shoulder lightly and tried to smile, but it fell short. Worry and guilt flashed behind Tsukauchi's eyes and he pulled away. "You think there is some connection between All for One's escape and I want to try calling him again?" Izuku blurted, interrupting the principal without thinking. Maybe he's just having a bad day. He goes back to his apartment when he feels sick or hurting because he doesn't want us to worry at the dorms and he thinks we don't notice." "Midoriya," Tsukauchi ran his hand through his hair before sighing. "His apartment was the first place I checked." "Oh," Izuku faltered. "Go ahead," Principal Nedzu said calmly, taking a small sip of his tea. "No harm in trying." Izuku blinked owlishly at the principal in surprise then hastily nodded, calling All Might. It went to voicemail, as it had all morning. Detective Tsukauchi frowned slightly, but said nothing. Maybe Izuku dialed again. It rang and rang. "This is Toshinori Yagi. I can't answer the phone. Please leave a message." A knot of dread in Izuku's gut tightened. "Please answer All Might," he whispered, and dialed again. It rang once, twice, and a third time. It abruptly stopped. No voicemail, only silence. "All Might?" Izuku tentatively called out. His voice faintly echoed back through the speaker. Something rustled, the heavy sound of metal against metal. "All Might," Izuku's voice trembled with uncertainty, the dread coiling dangerously around his lungs. "Are you there? Midoriya, my boy." All Might's voice rang out sharply. The call dropped. The office was silent until Principal Nedzu crawled off the couch and walked over to his desk. He picked up the phone and dialed. Midnight, if you would gather the faculty. Teachers meeting in my office. He paused, yes, discreetly please. Thank you. Nedzu returned to the couch, but did not take a seat. Detective Tsukauchi, how soon can you file a missing person report? Given the circumstances, I will, as soon as I get back to the station, Tsukauchi said. Izuku barely heard them. He clutched his phone while shaking hands. All Might's voice reverberated faintly in his skull. He sounded scared and desperate. All Might never sounded like that. He'd always smiled too. A hand on Izuku's shoulder jolted him from his thoughts. Detective Tsukauchi knelt down in front of him, understanding in his voice when he said, All Might is going to be okay. Tsukauchi smiled, and it reached his eyes, he's All Might. We just have to have faith in him. Alright. Izuku gaped at him, hadn't he heard? Then nodded. He pocketed his phone and curled his hands into fists. That's right, Izuku reassured himself, he's All Might. He's All Might. I'll have the teachers form search parties when they are on patrol. At the very least we can begin to canvass the area. Principal Nedzu said, spreading a map over the coffee table, you said you saw him leaving your home last. Yes, Tsukauchi answered, pointing to his address on the map, and the car left going west. How can I help? Izuku asked, popping up off the couch, and was rewarded with uncertain glances. You have classes to attend, Principal Nedzu said, as if it were the most obvious answer. But All Might would want you to focus on your studies. He is your teacher after all, Nedzu continued, how would he feel if you fell behind? Izuku struggled to find an argument, but Tsukauchi gently pulled him aside. Leave this to us, Midoriya, the detective said softly, with your teachers and myself working together, we're bound to find All Might in no time. He gave Izuku's shoulder a small squeeze. It's fantastic that you want to help. All Might would be so proud of you, but he would want you safe and busy with your studies first. Izuku's gaze fell to the floor, his vision blurring. He wiped away the tears before they could fall. I know. But boy, Tsukauchi smiled, can you make it back to the dorms on your own? Yeah, Izuku nodded. Come on then, Tsukauchi shook Izuku's shoulder lightly, smiled, and straightened those shoulders. We'll bring him home. Izuku straightened marginally and forced a small smile. That's it. The detective patted Izuku's back a little forcefully, and Izuku couldn't help wincing and smiling genuinely. Off you go. Izuku left the principal's office, passing a few curious teachers as they went into the impromptu meeting. Finally alone wandering the halls of the empty school, Izuku let the smile drop. He couldn't shake the dread. Instead, it curled deeper in his gut, hidden and coiled tightly. One for all stirred just under his skin, and Izuku shuddered at the sudden jittery rush, the strong urge to just do something. But Principal Nedzu and Detective Tsukauchi said to let them and the other teachers handle it. So he would. Izuku sped up to a jog, one for all flaring up and sending him flying down the halls and out onto the school grounds toward the training field. He needed to do something, so he would train. It's what All Might would want, right? Toshinori woke with a start when the door unlocked with a loud click. He blinked at the bright light and rolled his painfully stiff neck. He nodded off sitting up. He watched as the young nurse pushed the door open with his foot, a tray of food in hand. When Isamu glanced his way, the nurse managed a small smile. I was a little worried it wouldn't fit, Isamu said, looking over the plain hospital gown Toshinori wore. His smile fell, and he turned his back on Toshinori, setting the tray down on the counter by the door. I'm really sorry about your shirt and all this. Toshinori hummed neutrally. Isamu jumped a little and faced Toshinori, brows furrowed slightly. You can still, he shuffled slightly, can you still talk? Toshinori coughed and rubbed his throat with a shrug. The last time he attempted speaking, his words were drowned out by a painful gurgling noise that sent him into a coughing fit. Isamu looked a little disappointed, but you can still understand everything. Toshinori snorted, tapping his temple and grinning cheekily. He glanced at the clipboard hanging by the door and gestured for the pen and paper. Isamu followed his gaze and, quick on the uptake, unhooked the clipboard from the wall. He paused then, clipboard in hand. A look of uncertainty and fear flashed across his face, and he glanced back at the door. She'll notice if paper goes missing, Isamu muttered, nervously clutching the clipboard tighter. Toshinori huffed in frustration, but nodded in understanding. I'm sorry, Isamu mumbled, returning the clipboard to its hook. He gestured to the food on the counter, and I brought dinner. Toshinori's head jerked up, and he locked eyes with the young nurse. He brought up his arm and tapped on the shackle around his wrist. How long? What time is it? Isamu pulled up the sleeve of his scrubs, then froze. He winced and avoided Toshinori's gaze. I'm not supposed to say. I shouldn't have said dinner, he clutched his shaking hands together, I shouldn't have, that was stupid. Toshinori rapidly clapped his hands twice. Isamu jolted. Toshinori gave the young man a pitying smile and a thumbs up. It's alright. It's not okay, Isamu shook his head, it really isn't. Toshinori sighed, leaned against the wall, and patted the spot beside him. Take a seat. Isamu paused, pulling his sleeve over his watch, then hastily grabbed the food tray. He walked over and lowered himself to the floor just out of Toshinori's reach and slid the food across to Toshinori. It's a start, Toshinori thought wryly. Isamu gestured to the canned green tea. I heard you like tea, and there's a vending machine. He trailed off awkwardly. A small smile tugged at the edge of Toshinori's lips as he reached for the can. The chain scraped against the floor loudly, and he caught the way the nurse tensed at the sound. He lifted the can, spinning it around. The brand was common, one that Toshinori had before. Toshinori cracked open the can and took a slow sip. It was still cold and soothed his sore throat. He set the can down and looked over the rest of the food. He couldn't help but grimace at the hospital broth and jello pack. Oh, Isamu winced, grabbing Toshinori's attention. I should have known you wouldn't like it, considering he gestured to Toshinori's covered abdomen. Isamu furrowed his brow, that looked pretty bad. What an understatement. Toshinori laughed, loud, and barked as it had always been. Something suddenly caught in his chest and he tasted iron. He hastily raised his fist to his mouth, riding out the coughing fit. Ah. Isamu scrambled forward, grabbing at the stethoscope around his neck, but Toshinori held up a hand. Isamu froze, still leaning forward indecisively. Toshinori huffed, a little breathless, and wiped the blood from his chin. Don't worry about it, he waved his hand dismissively. He gently tapped at the left side of his chest and shrugged. He took another swig of tea to wash the metallic taste from his mouth. I should still check, Isamu said, scooting closer and sliding the food tray to the side. You really shouldn't shrug something like that off. Toshinori shook his head but sat up straighter as the nurse popped in his stethoscope earpieces. Isamu pressed the chest piece to the right side of Toshinori's chest, listening as Toshinori took as deep a breath as he could. He frowned at the faint wet rattling and moved the chest piece to Toshinori's back. Then he moved it to the left side of his chest. He furrowed his brow and moved the chest piece slightly. Toshinori patted the nurse's wrist and Isamu jerked away. He held his hand over the place where his lung had been and tried to laugh it off, but Isamu's stricken expression didn't fade. Isamu sat back, eyes taking over Toshinori's skeletal form. Why are you here? Isamu asked. You should be resting. You're retired. You don't have a lung. Why? The nurse ran his hand through his short dark hair. Toshinori gave Isamu a quizzical smile. He pointed to himself and flexed, his skinny bicep trembling slightly at his effort. I'm All Might. Isamu shook his head in disbelief. How long have you been like this? The young man asked, his voice quiet. Toshinori blinked in surprise. That scar was old, Isamu continued, staring at the spot in a daze. Toshinori sighed and held up 6 fingers. 6. Isamu's eyes widened. Wait, years. 6 years. Toshinori shrugged and rubbed the back of his neck, tensing slightly when his fingers ran through the ridge of hair. Did he do that? That man. Toshinori's hackles raised and he brushed them down, pinning the floor with a dark glare. He's the villain you beat at the Camino ward, isn't he? Isamu asked. I saw that fight on TV. He looks like him. He even has a helmet. Before Toshinori could answer, the pager on Isamu's belt buzzed. The nurse looked at his watch and paled. I have to go, Isamu blurted, abruptly standing and rushing to the door. I already stayed too long. He paused at the door and briefly glanced back at Toshinori. I'll bring a notebook next time. Then he left, locking the door behind him. The hospital broth and jello had no substance and settled oddly in Toshinori's gut. He sipped at the little remaining tea left in the can, wincing at the growing burning ache in his chest. While the full body ache and exhaustion had faded, eating anything gave him heartburn without fail. I'm surprised it isn't worse, Toshinori thought with a frown, recalling the warped waste bin and the chemical burns on his shirt. He absently rubbed his abdomen. What's the extent of the changes? He raised the can to his lips again and grunted in annoyance when he found nothing left. He huffed and crushed the empty can between his hands. Tapping it idly against his palm, Toshinori closed his eyes. The meal had been dinner according to the young nurse, so it was evening or night. Given the number of meals since his arrival, Toshinori estimated he had been here 2 or 3 days. That was assuming the meals were spaced evenly, which wasn't likely if All for One was hoping to disorient him. The fear in Isamu's voice implied as much. Poor kid, Toshinori sighed and chewed thoughtfully. People like Isamu did not follow All for One by choice. That woman, Tatsumi, was more the type. Cold, calculating, and lacking empathy. All for One likely appreciated that and found her useful. From what Toshinori had seen, Tatsumi was charged with keeping an eye on Isamu. Toshinori swallowed and sighed in relief when the empty, burning ache in his gut settled. He bit down again, savoring the crunch as he chewed and swallowed. Crunch. Toshinori furrowed his brow. None of the food. His jaw clenched and his hand closed tightly around the empty aluminium can. A jagged torn piece cut into his palm. Shit. HHK Toshinori cursed through grit teeth and ran his free hand over his face. He wished he felt nauseous, but he didn't. The burning in his chest had already subsided. He chucked the half-eaten can across the room. It hit the door with a loud tiny tap and skittered across the white tile floor. Toshinori put a hand over where his stomach had been, gripping the hospital gown. He let his head fall back against the wall and he took a deep breath. So, that's what changed. Toshinori adjusted the chain wrapped around his arm and tugged again, pressing his feet against the wall and putting his back into it. The chain protested, metal links grinding against each other, but did not budge. What I wouldn't give for a little of my old strength. HHNG. Toshinori grunted and fell, the chain roughly unraveling from his arm. He lay on his back panting and cringed when his shoulder popped back into place, the healing quirk quick to activate. Overdid it. Shit. A wave of exhaustion overtook him and he shuddered. The ceiling spun and he had to close his eyes for a moment. He let a slow groan escape him and rubbed his sore shoulder. Adjusting well. Fuck. Toshinori's eyes shot open and he tensed, adrenaline rushing and preparing to fight. All for One stood in the center of the room, still and calm. Toshinori glared at the masked villain as he slowly shifted off his back and pushed himself up. Pain shot from his shoulder, radiating down his arm and across his back. His arm shook. All for One said nothing, but there was a smug air about him that made Toshinori's hackles bristle. Toshinori rose to his feet and stood tall, eyes flashing with stubborn pride. All for One had his arms folded behind his back in an easy, relaxed manner. He turned slightly, pretending to look around the small bare room. "I'm surprised this place is to your liking," he said, as he continued to turn until his back was to Toshinori. "Bastard," Toshinori thought bitterly, as he glared daggers at the back of All for One's head. Glare was all he could do, and the bastard knew it. "Damn you. I can only assume that it must be since you haven't left," All for One continued, turning back to face Toshinori. "After all, the door is right there. Surely chains aren't enough to hold you back." He tilted his head. "Where's that strength you so desperately clung to? You used to be so eager to show it off." Toshinori's fingers twitched, itching to curl into fists. He couldn't let the villain get a rise out of him. The acidic burning ache flared angrily in his chest, but he kept his expression firm. His bristling hackles betrayed him. All for One hummed neutrally and brought his arms to his front, fiddling with something in his hands. Toshinori couldn't stop his grimace when he realized what it was. It was the can, crushed and missing chunks. "I am particularly fascinated by the quirk Devour," All for One said in a relaxed, matter-of-fact tone. He turned the can around in his hands, tracing the sharp edges of the missing chunks with his fingertips. Its main trait is the production of corrosive digestive fluids that can, given time, break down just about anything, even refuse, as you found out so quickly. The acidic pain bubbled higher in Toshinori's chest, and he swallowed roughly. Another wave of exhaustion rushed through him, and the pain lessened marginally. "You lack so much," All for One gestured to Toshinori's torso. "I thought perhaps that would create some complication, but it appears to have assimilated well. I am curious how it adapted without the stomach." He lifted the half-eaten can higher. "It may explain your cravings." All for One strolled forward, still fiddling with the half-eaten can. Toshinori tensed and slowly moved to the side, circling around to the left and keeping his eyes firmly on All for One. All for One placed the can on the low wall by the toilet, then looked up. "Ah," the masked villain's back was still to Toshinori. "Are you confident you have enough room for that maneuver?" Toshinori frowned and glanced at the chains. All for One slammed his hand against Toshinori's face, pinning him against the wall in a single movement. "Fuck." Toshinori grunted in pain, blood and bile bubbling up his throat and into his mouth. He grabbed at All for One's arm, pushing away. His arms shook with the effort, but he only managed to bunch up All for One's sleeve. He readjusted his grip against the villain's bare wrist. His skin was clammy and unyielding. "Holy shit. Get off. Damn it. Are you done?" All for One asked, his voice patronizing. Toshinori held the villain's arm in a white-knuckle grip. A frustrated noise erupted from the back of Toshinori's throat, and he coughed. Pain flared in his sinuses, and blood dripped from his nose. His eyes burned a furious blue. All bark All for One sighed, the sound almost metallic behind his mask. All for One easily turned Toshinori's head up and to the side, his thumb sliding from the sunken cheek to the jawbone. "Devour has another interesting trait," All for One said. Toshinori grit his teeth as the hand squeezed and pressed against his mouth. "Shit. Shit. Shit." He pushed at All for One's arm with renewed vigor, fingers clawing at the skin, but to no avail. "But Devour, the jaw develops the capability to unhinge," All for One continues easily, prying Toshinori's jaw open and pressing down, which you will need to do if you don't want it to break like that. Toshinori painted and glazed, his jaw pressed wide open. A strange feeling of painless dislocation pulled at the back of his jawbone. All for One hummed in satisfaction. He raised his other hand. His forefinger extended as he prepared his quirk activation ability. It also strengthens the bite. Ashinori tensed and snarled against the hand pressed between his teeth, the noise muffled and feral. All for one brought the finger to the side of his jaw. Don't. God damn it. And pressed. Ashinori's jaw snapped shut. Bone snapped between his teeth and blood seeped around his tongue. Fuck. God damn you. Ashinori tried to loosen his bite, but his jaw wouldn't budge. His tongue pressed against the back of his mouth, trying to keep the damned blood from his throat, and held his breath. All for one tilted his head curiously, his forefinger still pressed to Toshinori's jaw. He leaned in closer. Toshinori could see his own harried reflection in the man's mask. Your stamina is commendable, but I have the upper hand here. The edges of Toshinori's vision grew spotty. His diaphragm heaved painfully, and he inhaled sharply through his nose. The second he drew that first breath, All for one withdrew his forefinger and returned control to his jaw. Ashinori choked and spluttered. He couldn't prevent blood from seeping down his throat. His eyes burned with hate. Damn it all. Lips curled in a snarl, Toshinori mentally threw every curse he knew at his enemy, unable to truly voice them. His shoulders heaved as he wheezed and he wiped the blood from his face and spat. All for one stepped away, examining his mangled hand. Usually when I create their minds shatter after the first additional quirk. But you, what a fascinating specimen you are. I expected as much, but to see it confirmed, All for one straightened his rumpled sleeve. Could it be your contact with the quirk I fathered or your quirkless nature? All for one chuckled darkly. I suppose I could test that on one other. Izuku's smiling face flashed in Toshinori's mind and he lunged forward. Stay away from him. All for one turned his back on Toshinori once again, picking up the half-eaten can from the lower wall. He turned it over in his hand, brushing the jagged edge with the tip of his thumb. He paced to the center of the room and placed it down on the ground. All for one made his way toward the door and called back, perhaps this next quirk will tame you. Toshinori glowered, his face flushed and breath ragged. He ground his teeth as the door shut. It won't. It's a long way down. Toshinori massaged the back of his left hand, scowling at the quickly healing bruise. At some point during his struggle against All for one, his IV was yanked roughly from his skin. The tube dangled from the IV bag and coiled on the floor. A small puddle had already formed around the tip, the clear solution zigzagging along the grooves between the tiles, where it mixed with the blood on the floor. The red tinge flowed like macabre ink, following the solution back to its source, and defiled the small pool. Toshinori spat into it. He could still taste copper, and his breath smelt of rust. Nausea churned in his gut, and he let his hands drop to his sides. Damn it, pathetic. Toshinori's jaw aches, and he rubbed its side, cringing at the memory of All for one's hand pressed against the bone. He fell along the back of the jawbone. His fingers paused at a knot and it dipped just below his ear. He frowned and pressed his fingertips against the spot. Slowly, he opened his mouth, feeling, as his jaw hitched at one point before he gently moved his jaw back. Oh. Toshinori blinked at the feeling of his jaw sliding smoothly out of place before popping it back and closing his mouth. That's an odd feeling. He sighed and plopped down on the ground, leaning back against the wall and resting his elbows on raised knees. He clasped his hands together loosely, rubbing them together absently. He closed his eyes and bowed his head, letting his exhaustion sweep through him. His face still ached where All for one had held him and his back where it had slammed against the wall. A sorry reminder of how frail his body truly was without one for all. The memory of his own hands wrapped around All for one's arm flashed behind his eyelids. His fingers were too thin and arms too weak. Rope-like muscles were all that remained of the hero he had been. He ran his hands up his arms and held his shoulders, resting his chin on top of his crossed forearms. He sighed and shook his head at himself. He never regretted giving his power away and still didn't. His clenched fist hovered in front of his face and he furrowed his brows, wish I could have gotten in one good punch. His face softened and he felt a small smile pull at his lips. I'm still me after all. All for one can't change that, he thought with a quiet laugh. He shook his head and let his hand fall back to his shoulder. It's a little victory. There was a light knock at the door. Toshinori looked up, his small smile growing lopsided with humor. The door unlocked and swung open. Nurse Isamu pushed it wider with his shoulder as he balanced a food tray and something else under his arm. The young man vibrated with nervous energy as he strode forward and immediately sat in front of Toshinori. He placed the tray down and held out the object he had under his arm. Toshinori's brows rose. It was a small notebook. I had to get a smaller one, but no one saw me bring it down. Isamu said as he handed it over with a simple black pen. Toshinori took the pen in hand and opened the notebook. Its pages were blank and crisp brand new. He quickly jotted a note on the top of the first page and turned the book for Isamu to read. Thank you. Isamu's expression faltered, you really shouldn't be. Toshinori pulled the book away, writing quickly. Cut that out, young man. I know. You were forced into this. I can tell. Not your fault. Isamu bowed his head and nodded, I'm sorry. Toshinori huffed loudly, grabbing the young man's attention. He abruptly hit the top of the nurse's head with a book. Cheer up, he wrote, and used his forefingers to push a smile on his face. Isamu rubbed the top of his head, eyes wide, as he stared back at Toshinori. You really are All Might, Isamu mumbled. A barking laugh burst from Toshinori, making him double over. His handwriting was shaky when he wrote, is that so hard to believe? Young man, I may not look it, but I am most certainly All Might. Why yeah. Isamu shifted on his knees, I bought some stuff from outside the hospital. Picked it up with my brief food. Toshinori glanced over the tray. Canned green tea, a styrofoam container with some kind of hearty soup, and another container with a simple salad topped with sliced cucumber. Breakfast, huh? Better than aluminium, Toshinori thought with a contented sigh. He jotted down a quick note and passed the book to Isamu before pulling the food tray closer. Tell me about yourself. Toshinori looked at the young man expectantly as he popped the plastic lid off of the soup. About Isamu gawked at the note, then at Toshinori. Toshinori nodded, foregoing the plastic spoon and sipping from the small container. Relief flooded him as the taste of copper was overwhelmed by the warm flavors of the soup. Well, when did that come out? Isamu suddenly stood, scrambling to collect the fallen IV tube and seal off the drip. He slipped slightly and looked down. Oh, he said in a small voice, his face pale. I'll clean that up. Isamu unhooked the IV bag from the pole, taking it and placing it on the counter by the door before stooping to the cabinet below and pulling out some paper towels. He was here then? Isamu asked, tearing squares from the roll and laying them over the spilled IV solution and blood. Toshinori hummed with a frown, nodding. Oh, Isamu glanced over Toshinori with a careful eye, the same look recovery girl gave Toshinori anytime he walked into her office. Are you hurt? Toshinori shrugged and went back to eating. He heard Isamu pause and sigh, obviously unsatisfied, but the young man continued cleaning the blood away from the floor. Toshinori turned at the sound of Isamu's quiet voice, I wanted to be a doctor. Isamu collected the wet paper towels and took them to the hazardous waste bin. Then he sat down in front of Toshinori again, rubbing at the short spikes on the back of his neck. Isamu gave a pained smile and gestured to the row of spikes that ran down his spine. I was quite the fanboy when I was younger, but my quirk is useless for any type of heroics. I owed it to my parents to live up to the strong name they gave me, so I tried to use my head. He laughed, small and a little self-deprecating. Studying was rough. Failing was worse, so I changed tactics. A few years later, here I am. Not quite a doctor like I planned, but close enough. I still make a difference. Toshinori gazed at Isamu. He blinked as Izuku's image momentarily superimposed itself on the young man and he set down his cup of soup. He hummed thoughtfully and picked up the notebook. Your parents must be proud. I know I will be. A stricken look crossed Isamu's face and he coughed in an attempt to disguise the tears that threatened to pour from his eyes. He rubbed at his cheeks and smiled at the floor. You're really too kind, Isamu said quietly, guilt weighing heavily on his shoulders. A familiar urge stirred in Toshinori's chest. He wanted nothing more than to relieve the young man's burden. He glanced at the shackles around his wrists and rubbed at his sore hands. I'll need to take care of these first. I want to help you. Toshinori's head snapped up, fixing the nurse with a curious gaze. I can't do much, and I'm no speech therapist. Isamu fidgeted self-consciously, but I've tended to patients with throat injuries before. The sounds are still there. We just have to find them. Toshinori's eyes lit up, beaming with pride. He bent over the notebook to write more, but his fingers and wrist moved stiffly. His brows creased. Am I getting arthritis in my old age? He huffed and stretched his fingers, wincing as pain shot up his arm. His joints throbbed. Are you alright? Toshinori nodded and turned his attention back to the notebook. He paused. What was I writing? He gripped the pen tighter as the edges of his vision blurred. He rubbed at his eyes with the heel of his hand. Not now. Not again. Sweat dripped down his face and he shuddered, exhaustion rushing through him. Isamu leaned closer, saying something. What was that, young man? I can't. A hand grabbed his shoulder and helped lower him to the floor. The pen slipped from his grip as his hands shook and cramped painfully. The bone-deep ache spread up his arms and coursed through the rest of his body. Toshinori pulled his legs closer as his feet cramped suddenly. A hand curled inside his own and another rubbed his back as Toshinori shuddered. He squeezed the hand back, fingertips digging into the smaller hand as a spasm racked him. I'm still me. I'll still be me. Still. Toshinori was on the floor when he woke up. He groaned and shivered. Drenched in sweat, his hospital gown stuck uncomfortably to his skin. He shifted slightly, glancing around the room. Isamu was gone and another food tray sat next to the one from the morning. Okay, Toshinori rolled slightly and pushed himself up. I'm alright. Something scraped loudly against the floor by his feet. His toes felt odd. Toshinori closed his eyes. Whatever it is, it'll be fine. He leaned against the wall as he caught his breath, exhaustion weighing heavily on his limbs. With a steadying nod, he looked down at his feet. Oh. His brows rose slightly and he wiggled his toes, or rather, claws. They curved sharply from his feet and the tips tapped against the tile floor loudly. Okay. Toshinori reached down to feel the claws and froze. He swallowed roughly, curling his hand into a half-formed fist, wincing at the sharp pricks in his palm. Shit. Toshinori laid his hands in his lap, palms up, and slowly flexed his fingers and claws. They moved stiffly. The skin of his fingers looked hardened, his fingertips stretched and curved to wicked points. He rubbed his fingertips together, frowning at the lack of sensation. Toshinori shuddered and closed his eyes as he let his hands fall limply in his lap. Fine. Claws. Okay. Acid curdled in Toshinori's gut, a reminder that he hadn't finished eating. He groaned, glancing at the food just out of reach. He nodded with a soft grunt and pushed himself from the wall, reaching out and pulling the tray from the morning however long ago that was closer. The soup was covered again by its lid, while the salad remained untouched. Toshinori fumbled with the lid, his claws piercing through the soft styrofoam bowl, but managed to open it. With a swift motion, he downed the cooled soup, pointedly ignoring the way his jaw felt as it automatically unhinged. Don't think about it, he thought, as his hackles raised. Toshinori put the styrofoam bowl down with a little more force than necessary. He reached for the chopsticks, breaking the cheap wood apart, and lifted the salad. He tried to hold the utensils correctly, but his claws moved stiffly and he struggled to keep his grip. His hold tightened and the chopstick snapped. He tossed them on the tray. Don't think about it. Toshinori picked at the salad, carefully eating with his claws. They bumped his teeth and clicked against them. His chest burned. Don't think about it. Toshinori abandoned the half-eaten salad in favor of the tea. He easily popped the top open and drank, relishing in the clean taste. Something normal. Something familiar. He bit down. His heartburn eased. Toshinori stared numbly at his empty, clawed hand. Something snapped. The room felt far too small, the air too thick. Fuck. Toshinori kicked the tray away and curled into himself, clawed fingers carding through his hair and covering his ears. He tucked his head between his knees and took a shaky breath. Stop. Stop it. Just stop. His breathing slowed. He vaguely realized his ears felt different, longer, and pointed. Don't think about it. He was tired. Don't think about it. Exhausted. Don't think about it. Don't think. Noumu. All Might, are you there? Toshinori's head shot up and clawed hands clutched the hospital gown at his chest. He panted as he looked around the bright room. He was sure he heard a memory. Izuku on the phone. Toshinori grit his teeth. Izuku needed him. He was still the boy's teacher. He had to live for his sake. He promised. He promised. His own words echoed back at him. Wanna give up? Wanna take it easy and rest today? You won't make it. Toshinori's hand stilled and his breathing grew steady. I still have a job to do. There was a knock at the door. Toshinori glanced behind him, pulling his claw away from the scratch line in the grout by the chain's base. Isamu opened the door, dressed not in scrubs, but casual clothes. An umbrella stuck out from his jacket pocket and he held a clear IV bag. When he met Toshinori's eye, the young man perked up. Oh, thank goodness you're awake. He exclaimed, placing his hand over his heart in relief. Toshinori eyed the IV bag and tensed when he saw bandages wrapped around Isamu's hand. An uneasy feeling coiled in his gut. Isamu closed the door behind him, then paused. You're really not a fan of hospital food, huh? Isamu said, but his voice fell flat. The tray Toshinori kicked had collided with the other, littering the floor with the remains of the salad and hospital sandwich. He stooped and quickly swept the food onto a tray and nudged it out of the way. Good, as new. Toshinori furrowed his brows when Isamu stuffed his bandaged hand into his pocket. I brought another IV bag, Isamu said, filling the silence with his chatter. He gestured to the back of Toshinori's left hand where the IV tube had been reattached. You were asleep for a while and I didn't want you to get dehydrated. How are you feeling? Toshinori lifted his hands, claws pointed up. Oh, yeah, those are new. Isamu looked away, busying himself with replacing the IV bag on the pole. He pointedly avoided using his bandaged hand. Toshinori coughed and rubbed his throat. Are you okay? Isamu asked. Are you? Toshinori curled an eyebrow and pointed at Isamu's bandaged hand. Isamu tensed ever so slightly and forced a smile. He raised his hand. I just cut it on something. It isn't a big deal. Toshinori huffed, pushed himself up and towered over the young man. He placed his hands on his hips. You're a bad liar. Isamu paled and backed away a step. You're a lot taller in person, Isamu said, his voice trembling slightly. Toshinori snorted, pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead, and laughed. With a shake of his head, he took 2 steps backwards and sat back down. He patted the floor beside him. "Take a seat, young man." Isamu hesitated, then sat beside him with his back not quite against the wall. "Here," he said, digging into his jacket pocket and pulling out the small notebook. "I couldn't leave it here." Toshinori flipped open the notebook and saw the old scribbled messages. He huffed and promptly bopped the top of Isamu's head with it. Isamu leaned away and spluttered, What was that for?" Toshinori tapped the previous notes with a claw and shook his head. He tore the page out and crumpled it. Carefully, he pulled the cap off of the pen, fumbling for a moment for a decent grip, and wrote, "You put yourself at too much risk already. Don't carry around evidence. Don't get hurt for my sake, young man." Isamu nodded, then jolted when Toshinori patted his back. Toshinori's eyes lit up as he was struck with a thought. He grinned and popped the evidence into his mouth. Isamu's eyes went wide as Toshinori chewed and swallowed, grimacing and sticking his tongue out in distaste. "Devour quirk," Toshinori wrote, "might as well use it for good. Keep you out of trouble." He winked as he drew a line under the word might. Isamu snorted and covered his mouth. "That's really lame," he said with a laugh. Toshinori pretended to pout, but a smile pulled at the side of his mouth. He gently elbowed Isamu before tapping the umbrella. "Raining," he wrote. Isamu nodded. "It's been raining for a while. There was a pretty bad storm, but it's supposed to lighten up." Still, he patted the handle of the small umbrella. "Can't be too careful." Toshinori nodded and jotted down a note, then pulled Isamu's bandaged hand from his pocket. He turned the notebook toward Isamu as he raised the bandaged hand higher. "Now tell me about your hand." Isamu sighed reluctantly. "It was an accident," Isamu said quietly, lowering his hand when Toshinori released it. "You really don't have to worry about it. Just really small punctures, that's all." "Did I do that?" Toshinori wrote, his brows furrowed in earnest. "It wasn't your fault," Isamu insisted. He flexed his hand and gently massaged it with his thumb. "A part of a nurse's job is to comfort the sick. I was just doing my job when your claws developed. You wouldn't get mad at a kid who can't control their quirk yet. It's not their fault if they accidentally scratch you or something. So, it's not your fault. You didn't ask for claws. You didn't ask for any of this." Toshinori blinked and he bowed his head a little, examining his hands folded in his lap. He held out his palm and pressed the tips of his claws against the softer skin. They were sharp and nearly bit into his skin with only a little pressure. Toshinori frowned and bent over the notebook again. "I'm sorry. You really shouldn't be," Isamu said. He pulled his legs up and hugged his knees. "It isn't your fault this is happening to you." Toshinori huffed slightly, seeing the young nurse's face twist with guilt. "You shouldn't be either," he wrote. "You and I are both in chains. How did you get mixed up with this?" Isamu bit his lip and he looked away from the notebook. He was silent for a long moment, then he let out a shaky breath. "Wrong place, wrong time," he muttered. Toshinori waited. "This hospital used to have a partnering medical lab in the Kamino ward," Isamu began, "mostly research and volunteer human trials. With so many varieties of quirks, medication development has to be widely tested before it can be approved for use. They also had a ward for terminal cancer patients. I worked there before that fight in Kamino. I helped make the patients as comfortable as possible, to help ease their passing. Well, there was a middle-aged lady who didn't have a whole lot of time left and no family to speak of. I figured I'd visit with her for a while after my shift. And he was there. He and my supervisor. Tatsumi called him sensei and said he was there to help. I didn't know she was helping him take that woman's quirk." Isamu hugged his knees tighter. "This was a few months before the incident at the Kamino ward," he continued. "Sensei, that villain showed me things. There were so many, and they had been people. I couldn't tell anyone, and I had to keep working there. Tatsumi had me moved to her shift. I'm pretty sure they had me followed when I went home. I don't know how many doctors and nurses worked under him, but I recognized some of the people who worked on them. I didn't want to help them, but I didn't want him to take my quirk or make me one of those things." Isamu suddenly tensed and looked at Toshinori in horror. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean you aren't." He bowed his head in shame. "You're still All Might. You aren't like the others." Toshinori frowned sadly and let out a long sigh. He wrote for a moment and placed the notebook on Isamu's head. Isamu flinched at the soft touch before pulling the notebook in front of him. "I am sorry you had to go through that. I am sorry I wasn't there to help you." Toshinori squeezed the young nurse's shoulder, careful with his claws. His grip tightened when Isamu sniffled. Isamu sat a little straighter and forced a laugh. "You have hero friends, don't you? They've got to be looking for you." Isamu looked at the locked door. "I hope they find you." He passed the notebook back to Toshinori and turned fully toward him. "Okay. Let's work on getting your voice back." Tatsumi doesn't work this part of the shift, so we have all the time in the world. Detective Namasa Tsukauchi sat at his office desk and rummaged through the files piled haphazardly over its surface, attempting to make some sense of the disorder. Since when had he become so disorganized? Namasa pinched the bridge of his nose. His gaze strayed to the small file on the right corner of his desk, where the mess of papers did not touch. It was too important to be lost. The phone rang. Namasa sighed and forced his thoughts away from the missing person report. He brushed aside the paper on the phone and answered, Detective Tsukauchi speaking. It's Yori from Evidence. You need to see what we found. They paused. You said to call you first if it's about the Yagi case. Namasa was out the door before the receiver clicked back into place. Toshinori, a quick trip in the elevator, and Namasa burst into Evidence. Ryuko Yori quickly stood and adjusted their glasses as Namasa entered the room. That was fast, they remarked, turning and motioning for Namasa to follow. We found the car. Namasa's eyes widened. Wano, where was it? Yori looked back, a scowl on their reptilian face. Their eyes narrowed. Oh, you love this. The perpetrator has quite the sense of humor. It's a complete mockery of everyone's hard work. Oh no. Namasa unconsciously picked up his pace as they neared the Evidence garage. The car was parked in the center of the garage, fully intact, not a scratch on it. Floodlights pointed down, lighting up its interior. Lab technicians milled around it, taking pictures and making notes on their observations. You want to know where we found it? Yori spat out with distaste, gesturing to the vehicle, as if it wronged them. It was parked right outside the PD. We pulled security tapes, but they aren't much help. We're still processing the outside. The driver? Namasa asked, circling around the car, careful to stay out of the photographer's way. Unknown. The streetlight went out when the car approached last night. Possibly due to a quirk. The cameras only caught the driver's silhouette, which didn't match the description of the escapee. Unless he has some shape-shifting quirk, it wasn't him. Namasa nodded grimly, so, he got someone else to drive it here. What about other evidence? You wouldn't call me down for just this. Correct, Yori swiftly put on gloves and opened the back passenger side door. We found clothes, presumably belonging to Toshinori Yagi, in the back here. A coat folded neatly on the seat and a pair of shoes and socks. There was a small blood stain on the coat's lapel. It's being checked for DNA now. They shut the car door firmly and led Namasa back into the lab. Yori pulled out an evidence bag and placed it on the light table. We found a note and these clippings in the coat pocket. Namasa remained silent, paling, as he looked over the clippings, each one a news article describing the capture of Noumu. USJ. Hosu. Kamino. Dread coiled in his gut. There was no question now. All for one took Toshinori. He shoved that train of thought aside and swallowed the lump in his throat. You said you found a note. Yori looked him over and Namasa saw their tongue test the air nervously. They placed the bagged slip of paper in front of him. Neatly curved lettering took up the center of the small card. Keep them. I'm making another. Namasa clenched his fists and his expression darkened. Anything else? Yori flinched at Namasa's clipped question. No sir, they said, scaly green brows furrowed in concern. You'll be the first I call if when find anything else. Namasa nodded once. I'll see myself out. Yori's voice trailed off as Namasa neared the exit. We'll find your friend, sir. Namasa stopped at the door, hand on the doorknob. Thank you, Yori, he said, his voice tense but professional. Keep up the good work. Once Namasa reached the stairwell, the dread held in his gut twisted painfully and emotion surged through him. He braced himself against the wall as his arms and shoulders shook. Namasa finally let out a shaky sigh. Toshinori is alive. I'm making another. Damn it, Namasa ran a hand down his face, his new hope tainted by what the note and newspaper clippings implied. He covered his mouth as nausea soured his stomach. That first at USJ. Namasa's own words haunted him. Welcome to discover that he has the DNA of at least four completely different people mixed into his own. Was it Toshinori? His gut clenched and he roughly swallowed the bile in his throat. What am I going to tell the kid? His voice echoed quietly in the empty stairwell. Namasa took a steadying breath and furrowed his brow. Righteous fury burned in his chest, fury he and Toshinori shared. No. Focus on finding Toshinori first. Namasa's strength returned as he climbed the steps, plans already forming in his mind. All for one needed a lab for the horde of back in Kamino, an abandoned warehouse. Areas away from the public eye, that was all for one's MO. Toshinori likely hadn't even left the city with how arrogantly all for one abandoned the vehicle. Narrow the scope. Think. Stay strong, All Might. Stay strong, Toshinori. We'll find you. Toshinori hummed soft and low, tapping the tips of his claws in time to the rhythm. Humming had been Isamu's idea, a simple way to warm up and loosen his vocal cords. Every now and again his voice would catch and crack painfully, but the more he hummed, the less that happened. Earlier, Toshinori tried speaking with mixed results. The movements of his mouth and tongue were the same, it was his throat that threw a wrench in his attempts. At best, he ended up croaking syllables and letting out broken groans before his voice snagged painfully. It was a frustrating process, but all things worth doing were. The lines Toshinori clawed into the wall by the chain bases were growing deeper. If he could just pull the tiles away, he could figure out how best to remove the bases. He glanced at the screwheads he tried to unscrew from the wall. Unfortunately, his claws were not the correct shape. He only managed to strip the head and dull the tip of his claw. He huffed as a wave of fatigue passed over him and went back to humming, focusing on how his throat felt. The lock on the door clicked loudly and Toshinori tensed, his humming silenced. Nurse Tatsumi walked briskly into the small room, her presence worsening the headache behind his eyes. A small frown tugged at the corner of his mouth, but he forced an overly polite smile. "Evening, nurse," he thought with mild venom. "Oh," she deadpanned, meeting his defiant gaze, "you're awake again." Toshinori shrugged, palms up with a cheeky tilt of his head. "I know. Such an inconvenience," he wished he could say aloud. He hoped his challenging grin got the message across. To his surprise, the nurse sneered. "I see your claws came in. You're looking more like a proper weapon now," her voice sharpened, "that's all you are going to be, a tool." Toshinori's hackles raised and his claws twitched slightly. Pain spiked behind his eyes and he mentally shook off the irritation. Since when was he so temperamental? After a moment, he leaned back against the wall and gave the nurse an unimpressed look. "I've heard worse insults," Toshinori thought to himself, scoffing a little at the memories. Most of them came from either Gran Torino or a certain flame hero. Tool was tame. His hackles relaxed and he absently rolled his shoulders at the sensation. He was starting to get used to it. "The world knows about Sensei's escape now," Nurse Tatsumi said, her back turned to him as she went to the counter and opened one of the high cabinets. "Whoa," Toshinori furrowed his brow, "where did that come from?" There was an emergency broadcast and a press conference. It was quite the scene. The heroes and officials struggled to answer the reporters' questions, even though they had days to prepare. She glanced over her shoulder and Toshinori schooled his curiosity. "No mention of you, I'm afraid," her lips curled into a half smile. "I guess the world's already forgotten the great All Might. Not that a simple person would care about that." Toshinori snorted at her attempt to goad him. "You overestimate my vanity," he thought with an amused smile. "Besides, I know a few people who have not forgotten me." Nurse Tatsumi's eyes flashed with anger. "I wouldn't be laughing if I were you." She stepped closer and leaned into his personal space. "Don't think I haven't noticed when you get all glassy-eyed. Whether you like it or not, you are a glassy." Toshinori couldn't help the small, confused frown that tugged at his smile. He tried to think back, but his headache throbbed. Another wave of fatigue coursed through him. He felt so tired. "Why? There it is," Tatsumi said, dangerously smug, "Noumu." A small shudder ran down Toshinori's spine and his hackles rose. He hadn't realized he'd moved until his palm pressed against his forehead. Tatsumi hummed thoughtfully, "But you're still too self-aware." The others succumbed much faster. Then again, they were volunteers. They were easier to command. Volunteers. Toshinori's brows rose. Who would want petty criminals lusting for power? They got what they deserved. She stood, momentarily checking on the IV bag with a pensive frown. They were given power and were so eager to obey Sensei's commands. Toshinori watched her carefully, her tone putting him on edge. "I wonder how long you will last before you want to obey him." The edge of Toshinori's vision blurred and a spike of pain drove into his skull. He shook it off. A headache was nothing but fatigue. "Stand," Tatsumi commanded. Toshinori grit his teeth against the wave of exhaustion that followed her words, but remained seated. He glared up at the nurse. "Don't underestimate me. I am still All Might." But sweat dripped from his fevered brow. Nurse Tatsumi glared, her lip twisted in a sneer. "Don't think you're so high and mighty," she said, "you are created by Sensei. You flaunted your powers as All Might. You should be thankful you have more quirks now. Isn't that what you heroes want? To flaunt your powers? Where in hell did you get that idea?" Toshinori gaped at the nurse and shook his head. "Don't lie. You and the rest play heroes while others clean up the mess and the lives you leave behind." She circled around him, getting even closer, and eyed his haggard appearance. "Heroes aren't much better than villains. Civilians out of reach are nothing but collateral damage, aren't they?" Toshinori pushed himself to his feet. Then no. He shook his head, a clawed hand gripping and tearing the material above his heart. "They aren't collateral. Not to me. Not to any of us. We feel every loss." Toshinori stared down at the nurse, willing her to understand. Whatever her circumstances, she was hurting and embittered. All for One must have seen that in her and used it to his advantage. Toshinori reached out his hand to place on her shoulder and was abruptly yanked to his knees, chains coiled around his arms. He winced slightly but looked up at Tatsumi with pity. "Don't look at me like that." Tatsumi shouted, voice cracking. A shudder rushed down Toshinori's spine and his vision blurred. What? I wear. Someone was shouting. There. That's the look. You see? No, of course you don't. You're a. No. I'm not. I'm. Someone's shadow came close. Too close. His hackles raised. Sensei's going to set you loose one day, the person whispered, you will be the perfect weapon. He's going to use you to strike the heart of that false hero ideology you hold so dear, those youths already too far gone to save. They paused, your precious students won't even recognize you when you tear at their throats. The world flashed white and tilted. The scent of blood assaulted his nose. A low rumbling growl came from somewhere nearby. What? Toshinori painted, pinned to the wall by his wrists. He shook his head. The growl morphed to a groan in his throat. That was me. His arms fell, abruptly released. His claws scraped loudly against the floor as he slumped forward, blinking away the white lights that danced at the forefront of his vision. Toshinori lifted his head. His brows furrowed. A wide red smear trailed away from him leading to. Nurse Tatsumi knelt by the door, pressing her bloody arm close to her chest. How Toshinori's thoughts felt so sluggish. She needs help. There was something terribly wrong. Tatsumi hissed in pain and laughed, point proven. You need help. Toshinori pushed himself up on unsteady legs, stumbling back slightly before righting himself. Toshinori's throat closed and he coughed. He ignored it. It's alright. Why? He walked toward the injured woman. For IMH, don't come any closer. Toshinori took another step forward and reached out with his palm up. The woman thrust out her hand and a metal grip held Toshinori in place, his hand still outstretched. It took far too long, but the pin dropped. No, blood, her blood, stained the claws on his outstretched hand. Rivulets of it ran down his forearm and dripped onto the floor. He shook. No. I didn't mean. Nurse Tatsumi giggled, where did that light go? Toshinori looked up, eyes hidden in shadow. I'm sorry. Thanks for watching my video and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description, see you next time, till then sayonara.